ancient oath of the Krakow trumpeters. I swear on my honor as a Pole, as a servant of the King of the Polish people, that I will faithfully and unto the death, if there be need, sound upon the trumpet the high knell in honor of Our Lady each hour in the tower of the church which bears her name. It was in the spring of the year 241 that rumors began to travel along the high road from Kiev, in the land of Rus, that the Tartars of the east were again upon the march. Men trembled when they heard that news, and mothers held their children close to their breasts, for the name Tartar was one that froze folks' blood in their veins. As the weeks went on, the rumors grew thicker, and there began to come through to Poland, our land of the fields, the news that the country lands of the Ukraine were ablaze. Then it was heard that Kiev had fallen, then Lvov, the city of the lion, and now there was naught between the savage band of warriors and the fair city of Krakow, save a few peaceful villages and fertile fields. The Tartars came through the world like a horde of wild beasts. They left not one thing alive, nor one green blade of wheat standing. They were short, dark men of shaggy beards and long hair twisted into little braids, and they rode on small horses which they covered with trophies that they had gained in war. Brave they were as lions, courageous they were as great dogs, but they had hearts of stone and knew not mercy, nor pity, nor tenderness, nor God. On their horses they carried round shields of leather and iron, and long spears often trailed from their saddles. About their shoulders and thighs they wore skins of animals. Some decorated their ears with golden rings. Here and there one wore a gold ring in the nose. When they traveled, the dust rose high into the sky from beneath the hoofs of their little horses, and the thunder of the hoofbeats could be heard many miles away. They were so numerous that it took days for the whole horde to pass any one given point, and for miles behind the army itself rumbled carts bearing slaves, provisions, and booty, usually gold. Before them went always a long, desperate procession of country people driven from their humble homes by the news of the coming terror. They had already said farewell to the cottages where they lived, the parting from which was almost as bitter as death. So it has always been in time of war that the innocent suffer most. These poor, helpless peasants with their carts and horses and geese and sheep trudging along through the dust to escape, if God so willed, the terrible fate which would befall them were they left behind. There were old people in that procession too feeble to be stirring even about a house, mothers nursing children, women weak with sickness, and men broken-hearted at the loss of all that a lifetime of labor had brought. Children dragged themselves wearily along beside them, often bearing their pets in their arms. To this company Krakow opened her gates and prepared for defense. Many of the nobility and rich citizens had, in the meantime, fled to the west or taken refuge in monasteries far to the north. The brothers of the monastery at Zvierzyniec, a short distance outside the city, took in all the refugees that the building could accommodate, and then prepared to stand siege. But the great, weary, terror-mad mob that had fled ahead of the band of Tartars was content enough to make the city itself its destination. And once within its walls, all turned their faces toward the south. For there, in the south of the city, towering on its rocky hill high over the Vistula River, was the great, irregular, turreted mass that was the Wawel, the fortress and castle of the kings of Poland from the time of Krakus, the legend king, and the home of the dukes and nobles who formed the king's court. It had been decided to make no attempt to defend the city outside the castle gates, since that would entail a great loss of life. And so for several days the city dwellers who remained, and these refugees from all the country about, poured into the fortification and were housed inside its walls. The old castle gates, which were then on Castle Highway opposite the Church of St. Andrew, were at last shut and barricaded, and the walls were manned with citizen soldiery prepared to give their lives for the protection of the city and their families. The Tartars fell upon the city in the night and, after burning the outlying villages, pillaged the districts that lay about the churches of St. Florian, St. John, and the Holy Cross. The whole night long was one of hideous sounds. The crackling and fury of flames, the snarling and yelling of the enemy when they found that the prey had fled, their roars of triumph when they came upon gold and treasure. As morning dawned, the watchers from the Wowwell looked out over the town and saw but 3 churches not already in flames. These were the Church of Our Lady Mary near the Great Market, the Church of St. Andrew with its stalwart towers at the castle gate, and the Church of St. Adalbert in the marketplace. Already a colony of Jews in the Black Village had perished, also those refugees and town-dwellers who had not rushed inside the walls of defense. There remained but one man, or rather a youth, still alive in the midst of all that destruction. He was the trumpeter of the Church of Our Lady Mary, and he had taken solemn oath to sound the trumpet each hour of the day and night from a little balcony high up on the front of the church. As the first golden rays of the sun changed the Vistula from a dark line to a plash of dancing gold, he mounted this balcony to sound the Hynal, the hymn to Our Lady which every trumpeter in the church had in the past sworn to play each hour of the day and night, until death. Until death. He felt with a strange joy the glow of the sun as it fell upon him that morning, for the night had been. About his feet, down on the town highway, stood groups of short, fierce men gazing up at him curiously. Here and there the roof of a house was shooting upward in flames and belching forth clouds of black smoke. Hundreds of dwellings lay charred and ruined by the conflagration. He was alone in the midst of a terrible enemy. He might have fled on the previous day and gained the castle with the refugees and the town-dwellers, but he had been true to his oath and remained at his post until he should be driven away. Now it was too late to retreat. He was a very young man, perhaps 19 or 20, and wore a dark cloth suit that was caught at the knees with buckles, like the knickerbockers of a later generation. Dark, thick hose extended from the knees to the tops of his soft, pointed sandals, and a short coat falling just below the waist was held together in front by a belt. The head covering was of leather and something like a cowl. It fell clear to his shoulders and ran up over the head in such a way that only his face and a bit of hair were visible. "My mother and sister are safe," he thought. "May God be praised for that. They are gone these 10 days and must be now with the cousins in Moravia." It came to him then what a sweet thing life is. The sun over the Vistula was now reflected in the windows of the Cathedral of the Wawel, where the priests were already saying Mass. At the tops of all the gates he could see guards in full armor upon which the sunlight flashed. A banner with a white eagle hung in the air above the gate at the great draw. Poland lives, he thought. And then it came to him, young as he was, that he was part of the glorious company of Polish men that was fighting for all Christendom against brutal and savage invaders. He had not seen much of death before that minute. He had heard of it only as something vague. And now he himself was perhaps going out to meet it, because of his oath, because of his love for the Church, because of his love for Poland. "I shall keep my word," he mused. "If I die, it shall be for that. My word is as good as my life." Had a painter caught his expression then, he would have caught only the expression of a very great peace, an expression that signified somehow that God was very close. There was no moment of weakness, no faltering, no suffering even, for he did not think of what might come after his duty was performed. The sand in the hourglass already marked the hour for the trumpet to sound. "Now, for Poland and Our Lady, I will sound the hynal," he said, and raised the trumpet to his lips. Softly he blew at first. Then, thrilled with a sense of triumph, he felt in his heart a joy that was almost ecstatic. He seemed to see in a vision that though he might now die alone, and for naught save what perhaps some scoffing ones might call a foolish honor, still that bravery was to descend as a heritage to the people to whom he belonged, and was to become a part of their spirit, their courage, their power of everlasting. All this that moment brought. A Tartar below crouched to his bow and drew back the arrow as far as he could draw. The string whirred. The dark shaft flew like a swift bird straight for the mark. It pierced the breast of the young trumpeter when he was near the end of his song. It quivered there a moment, and the song ceased. But still holding to the trumpet, the youth fell back against the supporting wall and blew one last glorious note. It began strongly, trembled, and then ceased, broken like the young life that gave it birth, and at that moment those below applied the torch to the wooden church, and it, too, rose in flames to heaven, with the soul of the youth among them. Chapter 1. The Man Who Wouldn't Sell His Pumpkin. It was in late July of the year 1461, but the sun rose one morning, red and fiery as if ushering in midsummer's hottest day. His rays fell upon the old city of Krakow and the roads leading up to it, along which rolled and rocked a very caravan of peasants' wagons. They were drawn mostly by single horses hitched into place by the side of a rough pole that served for shaft. For wheels there were stout pieces of board nailed tightly together and cut round about, baked with fire at the rim to harden them. For body they had but rude cross-boards as a floor, with sides and ends of plaited willow reeds, so that the wagons had the appearance of large baskets traveling on wheels. As they moved along the road, often rough from holes and stones, out through fields sometimes, and even across streams, the wagons pitched about like little boats on a wind-swept sea. In many cases, the drivers were walking alongside the carts, flicking their long whips now and then above the horses' backs to give the animals a little encouragement, while upon the seats sat the patient figures of women and children. In the wagons was all manner of merchandise: vegetables, flowers, ducks, hens and geese, pigs, butter and milk. Here a driver was conveying a load of skins. Here one had nothing but black earth for enriching city gardens. Another, driving a load of poultry, wore around his neck, like beads, garland after garland of dried mushrooms strung upon strings. At the back of the picture rose the foothills of the Carpathians, misty and golden in the early sun, and at a distance the Vistula River curved like a silver bracelet about the Wawel Hill. All about was the early morning smell of wet grass and fresh earth and growing things. Market day had begun. All night some of these wagons had been traveling along the highways that spread out from the great highway that was the Krakow, Tarnów, Lvov, Kiev route. Some had been on the march for 2 days and 2 nights, so distant were the borders of the province. Here were men and women in town, dressed from the larger centers. Here were barefooted peasants in long coats and round hats. Here were peasant women in rough garments, but with headscarves and shawls of dazzling colors. Here were the inhabitants of a Jewish village, 12 men in black robes and black hats with the characteristic Orthodox curls hanging down in front of their ears. Here were boys belonging to the retinue of a local schlachkit or country gentleman, their leather costumes showing up to advantage beside the rather dingy dress of the male portion of the peasantry. Here and there were women with little babies. Here and there were old people trudging by the sides of their wagons up to market, as they had done for 30 or 40 years past. But every man in that caravan carried some sort of weapon, either a short knife at the belt or quarterstaff in the hand, or huge-headed axe at the bottom of the wagon. For thieves were abroad in great number at times of market, and it was even said that there were country gentlemen of ruined fortune who were not above recouping themselves now and then at the expense of some such caravan. Usually, however, it was on the return trip that the thieves were numerous, for then each villager and peasant had gold or silver as the result of the day's bargaining. Although practically all these wagons carried cargoes of goods, there was one which seemed strangely empty for market day. It had 2 horses instead of the usual one. Its shaft pole was stouter than those of the other wagons. Its occupants were better dressed than the peasants, and seemed somehow not like actual workers of the soil. In it rode the driver, a man of perhaps 45 years, a woman, his wife, some 10 years younger, and a boy who sat at the open end of the wagon, dangling his legs above the dirt and mud of the highway. "Now, wife," said the man, snapping a long whip at the off-horse. His wife was sitting beside him on a rude seat at the front of the wagon. "That high tower you see is a watch-tower on the Wowel Hill of Krakow. Should we go as flies the stork, we should reach there by the 8th hour. See, in the distance are the 2 towers of the Church of Our Lady. It is a welcome sight to my eyes after these 3 weeks on a rocking cart." The woman threw back a gray hood from her face and looked ahead with longing eyes.
"It is Krakow, then," she said, "the city of my mother."
Often has she told me of its glory, and yet I never had hoped to see it. God knows I wish I might see it differently and with less pain in my heart. But God gives, and man receives, and we are here at last." "Yes," said the man. For a long time they traveled along in silence. The man was musing on his early experiences in Krakow, the woman on her lost home in the Ukraine, and the boy letting his imagination run riot in speculation as to the sights that he should see in the great city. Their thoughts were brought suddenly from their own affairs to a commotion among the carts behind them. Drivers were reining in their horses and swinging them to the left of the road, narrow as it was, in order to let someone pass. The man whose thoughts had been thus interrupted turned around, trying to discern who it might be who was pushing forward through the long line of carts, and in a moment he saw that it was a rider on a small horse. "Way, way," the rider was shouting. "Do you peasants think that the whole road belongs to you? Stay on your farm where you belong," he shouted angrily at a peasant driver whose horse reared suddenly from the edge of the road to the middle. "Give me room to pass. You have no business on the high road with an animal that jumps about like that." "I had gone in the ditch else," replied the peasant without surliness. The rider glanced sharply at the contents of the man's wagon, and being assured that it contained nothing but fresh straw to be sold to brickmakers, dashed ahead until he was even with the cart which held the man and woman and boy. The last named had been watching his advance curiously. Now this boy, Joseph Charnetski, was in his 15th year. He was not by any means handsome, though he could not be called ugly. His hair and his eyes were dark, and his face was somewhat round and very pleasant. He wore rather rich, though travel-soiled, nether garments, not leather like those of the retainers, nor of coarse sacking like the peasants' clothes, but of a good quality of homespun, and a thick buttoned coat of the same material which fell skirt-like nearly to the knees. On his feet were brown leather boots, whose tops were soft and loose, and so high that they reached almost to the bottom of the coat. On his head he wore a round hat like a turban. The instant the rider perceived the boy, Klopak, "Chop back, boy, boy," he exclaimed in a rather croaky voice. "Tell your old man to hold his horses. You come and hold mine." The boy obeyed, but as he leaped from the wagon and grasped at the horse's bit-thong, he came to the conclusion that the stranger was no friend. In those days, when the world was just emerging from a period of darkness and cruelty, it was a necessity that each man should be constantly upon his guard against other men. Robbers abounded. Jealous friends often descended to mean tricks. Men of noble birth and breeding thought nothing of defrauding poor peasants, and among the poor peasants themselves were those who would commit crimes for the sake of gold. Therefore, when Joseph grasped at the horse's bit rein, he had already come to the conclusion, perhaps from something in the stranger's looks or speech or manner, that he was one to be treated with caution. He was attired in a retainer's suit of thick cloth. The jacket was short but concealed a coat of very light chain armor beneath. He wore for breeches not knickerbockers, but a single leather garment that combined doublet and hose in one. The cap was round, with a hanging jewel, probably glass, dangling behind against his neck. It was the face, however, that betrayed the soul beneath. It was a dark, oval, wicked face. The eyes were greenish and narrow, and the eyebrow line above them ran straight across the bridge of the nose, giving the effect of a monkey rather than a man. One cheek was marked with a button-like scar, the scar of the button plague that is so common in the lands east of the Volga or even the Dnieper, and marks the bearer as a Tartar or a Cossack or a Mongol. The ears were low-set and ugly. The mouth looked like the slit that boys make in the pumpkins they carry on the eve of All Hallows. Above the mouth was a cropped mustache which hung down at the ends and straggled into a scanty beard. The man carried at his waist a short, curved sword, and from the inside of his jacket could be seen protruding the jeweled handle of an oriental dagger. No sooner had the boy caught at his rein than the man was off his horse and with a leap had gained the wagon. Joseph's father reached quickly under the wagon seat for a short, cross-hilted sword. Not one step nearer, he shouted as the man came toward him with hand outstretched as if to take his hand. "Who you may be I know not, but I stand as a Christian till I find out what your errand is." The stranger stopped, smiled at the ready sword still in its scabbard, though with a sudden respect in his smile, then pulled off his hat and made a bow. "I take it that you are Andrew Charnetski," he said. "You take too much," answered the driver. "To strangers I am Pan Andrew Charnetski. Pan is a formal Polish term signifying sir or mister." The stranger bowed again. "I spoke as to an equal," he said. "I am Stefan Ostrovsky of Chelm, but now I am come from Kiev, where I have been on state business." It is known that one Muscovite has some important business with our Lithuanian provinces, and I, though I may not say by whom, was sent to learn. He broke off suddenly, as if wishing to give the impression that his business was such that he might not speak of it in public fashion. But on my way home men told me that a band of Tartars had come north from the Crim, pillaging much of the country about. Among the houses which they had burned and the fields which they had destroyed were the house and fields of one Andrew Charnetski, nay, I ask pardon, of Pan Andrew Charnetski, who was reported to have escaped with his wife and son in the direction of Krakow, where they were said to have friends. This being true, and since I was traveling in the same direction, I sought a description of Pan Andrew and his family, and this morning when I saw a true Ukrainian cart, drawn by 2 horses and not by one, and bearing a man and woman and boy such as had been described to me, I took the assurance to present myself and make my greetings to you." Pan Charnetski scrutinized the face, the clothing, and the figure of the stranger closely. "The half is not yet told," he said. "Nay," answered the other, "but the rest is perhaps a tale for you and me behind some heavy door when we reach the city of Krakow just ahead, I have heard." He spoke significantly, then with his hands he described a circle in the air. Charnetski watched him with his eyelids drawn half shut, so that he could focus his attention upon the man and see naught of the world outside. His heart was not so cold and steady, however, as one might think from looking at his calm, composed features. In truth, at the stranger's gesture, his heart was beating a tattoo against his ribs. He knew that almost every word the man had uttered was false. He knew that his name was not Ostrovsky, even though there had been members of that family in Chelm. Not one feature of the man's countenance was Polish. And there was that in the tone of the last words that had suggested a threat. Charnetski realized also that here was no chance meeting. It was 14 days and more since they had left the border. This man, he reasoned, had followed them all that distance, or had perhaps been sent by some person of higher rank to intercept them before they gained entrance to the city. "You have heard naught that concerns me," he answered shortly. And now, since the carts are leaving me behind, will you kindly return to your horse? I have nothing to say that will be of importance to you, nor do you interest me in any way." Charnetski spoke truly, for the carts ahead were already some distance away and the drivers behind were shouting at him angrily for blocking the traffic. "On the contrary," answered the stranger, "you have that which interests me greatly, and I will not leave you until we are safe behind some door in the city. Here, boy," he shouted at Joseph, "lead my horse along behind the wagon, for I intend to ride the rest of the way." Pan Charnetski's cheeks blazed. "Now, by the lightning, you make yourself too free here," he articulated. "State what business you have quickly and be done." The man glanced around the cart and he saw on the wooden floor just in front of the driver's seat a huge yellow pumpkin. "Ha!" he said, "a pumpkin, and at this time of the year. I suppose they raise pumpkins in the winter on the steppe. What shall be the price of that pumpkin?" "It is not for sale," answered Charnetski. "No?" I said no. "What if I offer its weight in gold? All's one. You will not sell? I tell you no." "Then," the stranger drew his sword quickly, "then you will fight for it," and he stepped forward toward the driver. Charnetski hesitated no longer. In the flash of an eye he had vaulted across the seat, dodged a blow of the saber, and caught the stranger's right wrist in a grip of steel. The sword dropped with a clang. Charnetski did not let the man go, however. He threw his left hand into the small of the stranger's leg, and with clutch upon arm and leg hoisted him high and tossed him out of the cart. He fell in the mud, sputtering with rage and calling curses of every description upon Charnetski's head. And at this minute Joseph, with admirable foresight, swung the man's horse about and struck him smartly upon the right flank. The horse reared and capered, then dashed off down the road in the direction from which the wagons had come. At the same instant the boy leaped upon the cart and shouted to his father, who climbed back to the seat and swung the long lash over the horses' heads. They were off in a second, leaving the stranger in the middle of the highway, turning now to the right and now to the left, as if uncertain whether to pursue his horse or his enemy. And Charnetski, swinging about, picked up the sword from the bottom of the cart and hurled it into the road. Some time later they reached the Kazimirs, the Jewish city founded by King Casimir more than 100 years earlier. Passing through this, they came to the bridge across the Vistula, which would admit them to the city of Krakow itself. Finding, however, that this bridge was undergoing repairs, they were forced to take the next bridge to the north. Thence they proceeded to the fortified gate called Mykolaiska, where they were challenged by the gatekeeper. Chapter 2. Kray. "Charnetski, Christian, wife and son," said Pan Andrew to a custodian who wore light armor and carried a halberd. He gave them a quick glance and motioned for them to pass. Another man in black peered into the cart to see what was inside, and, finding nothing, concluded that these were farm folk come up to the city to buy, and accordingly demanded but a few pieces of iron coin as tax. This paid, they took the road which ran from Mykolaiska gate to the Sukienis, the old cloth hall, which stood then, as it does today, in the very center of the city. Krakow was flooded with a golden sunlight. Joseph, who saw for the first time a large city, gaped in very astonishment as he glanced left and right about him. Front and rear, their cart formed part of the long, straight train of carts coming to the city loaded with products of the farms. Through this line were breaking from time to time splendid horsemen wearing breastplates of steel that shone like precious metal and carrying long swords dangling from the saddles. One of these men who pushed through the crowd just in front of their horses was so splendidly arrayed that the boy took him for a very high noble, or perhaps the king himself, the peace-loving king, Casimir Jagiello, the fourth of the name of Casimir, and he exclaimed, "That must be the king, father. See the shining armor and the jewels upon his saddle, and the sword must be of gold, for it shines like fire." And look, he pointed eagerly, see the Polish eagle worked in silver upon the saddlecloth. There beyond it is the White Knight of Lithuania. Is he not indeed the king? No, son, no. That is but one of the guard that waits on the nobles at the royal castle. All about them rose in the bright sunlight palaces, churches, towers, battlement walls, and Gothic buildings, as yet for the most part unadorned by the rich sculpture that was to come in a few years under the influence of the Italian Renaissance. In the distance rose against the turquoise blue sky the cathedral on the Wawel Hill, its Romanesque tower showing high above the city. Close at hand were the two towers of the Church of Our Lady Mary, not as they appear today since the hand of the master architect and of the renowned sculptor Wittstoss altered them, but rising unbelfried and uncrowned above the cemetery where white gravestones clustered at the base of the church. In the very middle of the market, surrounded by smaller wooden buildings, was the great cloth hall, used for the sale and exchange of cloth goods, already swarming with merchants who had been traveling all night, and for many nights perhaps, in order to close bargains early on market day before the money of purchasers had been spent elsewhere. Camped in the square outside the cloth hall were a number of Tartars who had come from the distant east to sell fine swords and cloths and jewels plundered from Muscovites or Bulgarians or Greeks or other travelers in the steppes. Facing the east as the rising sun had crept over Wawel Hill, they had chanted their morning prayer of praise to the great Allah. Their singing could have been heard mingling with the clashing of the great bell on the Church of Our Lady Mary and the chanted service of the Armenian merchants who had come in from Trebizond and the lands beyond the Black Sea with carpets and spices and fine rugs. Here, for the moment, in this great international capital of East and West, was worshipped every god that man knows. It might even be said that God himself was worshipped under many names and in many languages and dialects. Here were Turks, Cossacks, Ruthenians, Germans, Flemings, Czechs, and Slovaks with their wares to sell, and Hungarians with their wines from the mellow plains of Transylvania. As for money, there might be found zloty and guilder and groschen, silver in bars and precious stones, also plenty of token in kind, that is to say, certain varieties of merchandise such as amber, dates bound in packages, or even vegetables in containers, each of which had a recognized value over all the trade routes of the Hanseatic League. For the League merchants were represented here as well. Prosperous Germans or Dutchmen in long robes with fur collars, and they did business in every language known to man. While the boy drank in these unusual sights on all sides, there suddenly floated down from above the sweet notes of a trumpet. Looking directly upward, he could see the golden bell of a trumpet protruding from one of the tower windows of the Church of Our Lady Mary, and as he looked, the full dignity of the church burst upon him, its quiet strength which appealed to the eye being strangely mingled in his senses with the trumpet song which fell upon his ears. There were two towers rising high above the traffic of the street, rising unequally, he now noticed, for the nearer tower seemed a bit squat beside the farther one. It was from the higher tower that the trumpeter was playing. The tune was a little morning hymn, the Haynau, brought into Poland, some said, in the earliest days of Christianity by missionaries who came from the south. It was a simple little air, intensely sweet and appealing, but at a certain place the trumpeter broke the tune off abruptly, leaving but the echo of an unfinished strain to float down from above. It was as if someone at that moment had taken the trumpet from his lips. Joseph turned to his father in astonishment. "Isn't he going to finish the song?" The father smiled. "It is a long story, my son, and one that I will tell you at a later time." The trumpet sounded again from another window, then from the farther side, and finally at the north side toward the Florian Gate. 4 times the trumpeter had sounded the Haynau, ending always with the broken note. "He plays rather poorly," added Pan Charnetski. Now, though Pan Charnetski was a country gentleman, he was accomplished in many crafts. After having graduated from the University of Krakow, he decided not to remain in one of the professions, but rather to live on his father's estate and manage it as had been the custom for the men in his family. He had retained a love of music which he had studied in the university and played well upon brass instruments, the straight trumpet, the curved trumpet, and the trumpet with keys. Therefore, when he said that the trumpeter in the tower had not played well, he knew of what he was talking. The cart was now passing close to the cloth hall, and Joseph ceased to question his father any further concerning the song with the broken note because of the strange scenes which claimed his attention. Here stood a group of merchants in bright gowns. Wealthy they must have been because their long coats were of fine cloth, some lined with fur and trimmed with many silks. Beneath the coats were costumes of tight-fitting cloth. Joseph saw one man with the color of the cloth in the trouser of the right leg different from the color of the cloth of the left trouser, which to the boy had a ludicrous look. But when he noticed that many other men wore the same kind of garment, tight-fitting to leg and thigh, and of different color upon each leg, he ceased to smile and began to wonder. The wonder did not leave off for a while either, for other curiosities in dress caught his eye. The hats and head coverings were in their way as remarkable as the tight garments. Turbans were worn uniformly, some with pointed peaks, others simply masses of gaily colored cloth heaped up high on the head in twists and folds. Grotesque ornaments, too, were worn on the head. One man even had a stuffed or an imitation rooster, with legs and comb and all, perched on the crown of his high hat. The merchants wore curious leather footgear, most of the sandals being of soft leather with long twisted points. One man had sticks thrust into the leather at the toes, making his sandals appear at least 2 feet long. At the stalls around the cloth hall were all manner of wares which the sellers were advertising with loud cries. Here was a grain counter with different colored grains in open sacks. A woman in a blue gown which hung from a yoke at the shoulder, and with a piece of cloth of the same color wound deftly around her head for a hat, was selling a few grains of corn to a traveling musician. He wore a long yellow garment all of a piece, including head covering like a cowl and falling to the knees, below which the legs and feet were bare. This garment was caught at the waist by a bright yellow belt. He carried under one arm a bagpipe with 3 protruding tubes, 2 for music, if it might be called such, and 1 for his mouth. In one hand he held a pouch of leather into which the woman was slipping grains of corn. The Charnetskis drove by the stalls and shops of the glove-makers, where there were women working and buying, all dressed in bright-colored gowns, past the needle-makers in leather aprons who sprawled over benches, past the sword-makers with their neat forges and rows of shining steel blades, past the tub-makers who were assembling wooden staves into tub bodies, past the smiths in their long black aprons leading horses into position where they could be shod. Here and there the red signs of the barber and bloodletter, here and there the huge flasks of green and blue denoting the stores of the apothecaries. True Catholics had upon the walls of their shops an icon or a picture of the Holy Mother of God from the sacred shrine of Czestochowa. Almost every merchant had some distinctive figure above the door of his shop to distinguish it from his neighbors. For example, there was a hatter with the sign, "Under the White Elephant," and there was a shoemaker who had a stone head of Casimir the Great for the satisfaction of himself and his customers. The numbering of public buildings was not known in that age, and buildings were distinguished by some such emblem which usually stood above the outer gate or door. Everywhere could be heard the cries of vendors shouting or singing their wares or professions, the flower girls, the knife sharpener, the baker's boy, and the butcher's apprentice. Kobrakuje, they all shouted in a chorus. What do you lack? What do you lack? Occasionally, to Joseph's delight, a monkey could be seen, brought here by traders from the east or south, one playing around a booth, another carried, much bedecked with ribbons, in the arms of some merchant's or perhaps burgomaster's lady. Once or twice, amid the clamor of the market, rang the clanking of chains as poor wretches about to be fastened to the church walls by iron collars, or stuck in the pillory, or perhaps even to suffer a worse fate, were marched to the church for a last prayer before the sentence of the law was passed upon them. Life was a precarious thing in many ways in those days, and men and women for very slight offenses were beheaded or banished or thrown into terrible prisons. Now they passed a procession of pilgrims on the way to some shrine, men and women from the villages dressed in their good clothes, with the parish priest marching ahead of them and leading the chant which they were singing. The cross-bearer was a young man with stalwart shoulders and bright eyes. He had need of his strength, too, for he had sworn to carry the holy image of our Lord from his native village to Czestochowa, which was many miles distant. This company had already been on the road about 10 days. There were boys and girls, too, in the procession, and some had their minds upon serious things, but others were looking for the first time upon the glory of medieval Krakow, and would no doubt in their prayers ask forgiveness for too much attention to worldly things. The cart turned into Grodzka or Castle Street after leaving the marketplace, and went directly toward the Wawel. Near the Waywell Pan, Andrew swung the horses to the right and passed through a city gate and into a meadowy lane. In front of a large rambling palace that stood there, he drew up by the side of the road and leaped to the ground not far from a pair of iron gates that marked the entrance. At these gates he was accosted by an armed guard who, with a rather hostile air, blocked the entrance completely with his spear. "What do you want?" he asked sharply. "I seek Pan Andrew Tenzinski." The guard shouted something, whereat 5 men in armor came running from a little house near the gate. "Surround him," said the guard. This was done, much to the astonishment of Pan Andrew. "One of you run to the house and call the captain," next ordered the guard. "Tell him that a countryman is here demanding to see Pan Andrew Tenzinski." Pan Charnetski, trying to force his way out of the circle, was pushed back into the center by one of the armed men. At that he raised his voice in anger. "Who are you that dare detain me here? I am Pan Andrew Charnetski, first cousin to the Tenzinskis and proprietor of an estate in the Ukraine. I demand that you confront me with an officer in authority, and not treat me like one come here as an enemy." The men of the guard looked at each other in astonishment. Was it possible that this man did not know the truth, the report of which had already spread over the greater portion of Poland? The captain came in a moment with the returning soldier. He broke through the ring and walked straight up to Pan Charnetski. "What is your business here?" There was a certain pleasantness and courtesy in his voice that made Pan Andrew forget his anger for the moment. "You have a civil tongue, young man," he answered. "I take it that you are in command here?" "I am." "Then I will tell you, as I have told your soldiers, that I am Pan Andrew Charnetski, come this day from the Ukraine to see my cousin Pan Andrew Tenzinski on important business." "You come too late," answered the captain. "It is strange that you have not heard, for this news is now all about the country. Pan Andrew Tenzinski lives no longer. His kin have departed from the city for a time, and may return, I know not when. I am here for the observance of order, for the protection of the estate against enemies of the family." Pan Andrew started. "My cousin is dead. And how?" "It was like to nothing the city has seen these many years. For a long time there had been hot blood between the tradesmen and nobles. The issue came to a head through the dissatisfaction of Pan Tenzinski over some piece of armor that he had bidden a smith to make. He not only took the tradesmen to task, but refused to pay for the work he had done, whereat the whole guild rose against him. They pursued him through the streets and killed him in the church of the Franciscans where he had sought shelter. It was a sad and grievous thing, and his family, for fear of the mob, fled the city. The gentle Elizabeth, our queen, and may the blessing of heaven be upon her, hates all strife that may result in the shedding of blood, and she it was who persuaded our king to make peace between the townsfolk and nobles. He sent us here to protect this house, to be a guarantee against the shedding of any blood, for there are many who would willingly pillage this dwelling and kill the servants that are still here. We are but acting upon orders when we detain all persons who seek entrance here, and for the execution of these orders you must give us your pardon, since we seek but to avert further bloodshed." It seemed to Pan Andrew at that moment as if heaven had fallen about his ears. "Let me give to Pan one piece of advice," continued the captain. "Most willingly will I receive it," said Pan Andrew thoughtfully. "Get yourself from the city as quickly as possible if you be of any blood ties with the Tenzinskis, or else if you stay, change your name and manner of speech, lest some assassin make a mark of you for the benefit of his party. Sans K. I greet you then with a hail, as is befitting between equal pans, and request that, for your own safety, you depart quickly. But I must remain here. A band of pillagers, I know not whom exactly, though I think them the paid robbers of someone in high authority, have burned my house in the Ukraine and left not one stone upon another. My fields are ruined as well, and I am here to take refuge with my kinsmen, to bring them word of something very secret which must go at once to the ears of the king himself." "Alas," answered the captain, "I can give you but little help. The king is at this moment in Torin, where there are said to be plans against the military order of the Knights of the Cross, for he seeks there in the north peace at all odds. When he will return I know not, perhaps in a month, perhaps in a year. If you would await him here, I would, if I were you, settle in this town and take another name. Later there will come a retribution for these dark deeds against the Tenzinski family, and there will be more crows about the gallows." Saying which, he turned away and called the guard again to its post. Pan Andrew, however, stood motionless for a few seconds. The thoughts fairly burned in his brain. His friends, protectors, gone. The king away, he himself a fugitive here no less than in the Ukraine. From every side enemies pressed upon him, and what had he done to deserve such a fate? He was in a predicament even without this complication, for here he was in a great city where he had not a single friend. He had but little money, for what he had gathered had been invested year by year in his house and lands in the Ukraine. There were his wife and his son to be put in a place of shelter, and not only were the means lacking, but there was even peril at every hand. Behind him at the gates of the city had appeared one foe. Here in the city there were apparently many others. What to do? Well, let God give. There would be something. Aimlessly he got into the wagon, turned it about, and made for the market again. There at least they might spend the day, procure water for the horses, and buy a little of something to eat. He found a place near one of the springs, unloosed the horses with the help of his son, and let them crop the short grass that grew near one edge of the marketplace, watering them with buckets that he filled at the spring. Not until then did he seek comfort and counsel from his wife, who had always been his solace at such times. Throwing himself down beside her on the wagon seat, he told her the story of his late discoveries, the absence of the king, the death of his kinsman. For a second the woman's heart quailed before the fresh difficulties, but she forgot self at the look in her husband's face. Her quiet reply, "We will wait, for God is in the waiting," filled him with courage again. Joseph, however, was at that age when no sky remains long clouded. His heart had been beating fast with excitement ever since the sight of the city's towers had loomed before them in the early morning, and his legs had been itching to get out of the wagon and explore the place. He began by taking a short excursion over to a little building nearby, which at it proved to be a church with a low dome and round side windows. Although the church was of much interest to those who favored historical lore as being one of the oldest churches in Poland, it did not interest the boy greatly. He scrutinized the beggars at the door, a young boy with but one leg, a woman with a back bent to a curve, an old man with sightless eyes, praying continually, and many other wretched alms-seekers. Crossing himself and muttering a prayer for God's helpless creatures, Joseph turned and marched down Grodzka Street in the direction of the Wawel. He had just come to a cross lane which led on the left to the Church of the Dominicans and on the right to the Church of All Saints, when he noticed a Tartar boy in the street leading and constantly beating a large Ukrainian wolf dog. The wolf dog was on a leash. He had a strong hand-wrought collar about the neck, and he was turning now and then to glance back at his tormentor, who was plying a short Cossack whip. Joseph watched the boy in amazement, wondering why he had the dog and why he was beating him. As a matter of fact, the boy was acting out of pure viciousness, but neither of these questions found satisfactory solution in Joseph's mind. In a very few minutes, however, another question rose with the suddenness of lightning, a question which required action for a solution, and this action Joseph was able to supply. For at the moment that the boy and dog were crossing the church lane, there emerged from the farther footwalk a man dressed all in black like a priest, but wearing a collar which was not clerical since it opened in the front. He did not, however, for the moment attract Joseph's attention. It was his companion that caught and held the boy's gaze. For the companion was a girl of perhaps the same age as Joseph. She was walking by the side of the man in black and now and then grasping at his hand. Joseph saw the dog no longer. His eyes were riveted on the girl. She seemed to him like an angel taken out of a Christmas play, or a spirit from a festival of the Three Kings. In truth, she might have been one of those beautiful figures come to life out of the wondrous stained glass windows in the church. Her hair was light. Joseph's was dark. Her skin was as white as the finest linen, her eyes as blue as the skies above the Vistula. She wore a cloak-like garment of red that fell from her shoulders to her ankles and was girdled at the waist. It was embroidered in blue, with lace at neck and wrists. In front it did not meet of blue that fell in folds even below the outer coat. And as she looked up, the country boy thought that he had never seen anything prettier on earth. So daintily she tripped along that she seemed to walk on clouds. Then for a moment he looked down at his hands, dirty, hard, and grimy. He looked at his clothes and found them dusty and worn after the long journey. But if he had been in heaven at the sight of the girl, he came back to earth quickly. For the Tartar boy with the dog and the man in black with the girl were close together at the crossing of the roads, when suddenly the maddened dog turned desperately at bay upon his tormentor and crouched for a powerful spring. Joseph shouted and rushed forward just as the dog leaped. The Tartar boy dropped the leather thong in a flash and darted down the walk out of reach of the dog's jaws, but leaving directly in his path the man in black and the girl. Blind with fury, the dog sprang again, and in an instant he would have come down upon the girl, who happened to be on the outside, had not Joseph at the same moment leaped and caught at the dog's heavy collar. He had dealt with dogs many times in the Ukraine, and he knew that no dog is vicious if healthy and well treated. Therefore there had been no fear in this effort that he made, save for the peril, perhaps, that the dog might mistake him for the boy who had been beating him, and sink his teeth into his flesh. His fingers caught the collar squarely. The grip held, and he went hurtling through the air like the tail of a skyrocket, as the dog's leap, weighted by this unexpected load, fell short, and the girl drew back with a cry. But Joseph and the infuriated animal went rolling to and fro in a wild embrace on the hard surface of the road, he striving to make the beast pay attention to his words, the dog only becoming more and more frightened. But the boy knew, after the first second, when all depended upon whether his grip held or not, that everything was safe, and he could successfully avoid the paws and teeth of the dog. Thus, at a favorable moment, he released his hold quickly upon the animal's collar and scrambled to his feet, while a very dusty and possibly ashamed wolf-dog tore off like a streak of lightning in the direction of the Franciscans' church. Chapter 3. The Alchemist. Something heavy but kindly fell upon Joseph's shoulders, and something light touched his cheek. Looking up quickly from a survey of his garments, now more ragged and dusty than ever, he perceived that the weight was the hand of the man in black, and that the lightness had been a kiss upon his cheek from the man's companion. Her cheeks were flushed, and her eyes bright, and her lips were still close to him. He was somewhat dazed from the shock of going to earth so quickly with the dog, but he thrilled with pleasure and happiness from the kindly touch and the kiss. He stepped back to brush himself, and then gazed squarely at the man and girl. His cheeks grew rosy with that first meeting of eyes. For in the man's there was an ocean of gratitude and a suggestion of a tear, and the girl's eyes blazed forth frank admiration.
"You were so quick,"
she exclaimed. "Would that I could spring like that! It was brave of you!" His tongue found no words. Boys of 15, even if aged by experience, have little to say when praise is bestowed so freely. Moreover, the man gave him no opportunity. "Remarkable," he said, "remarkable." As swift a leap as I ever saw, and then blinking with his eyes as if the light hurt them, added, "or hope to see." "It was nothing," Joseph stammered. "Often in the Ukraine I have dispersed dogs in a fight." And then, thinking that this perhaps sounded like boasting, said further, "As do many boys of my age in that country." "From the Ukraine?" The man in black looked at him with interest. "How do you happen to be so far from home? Tartars or Cossacks burned our house. We have been traveling this day more than 2 weeks in a cart, only to find ourselves homeless here. Father had kinsfolk in this city, but the head of the house is dead and the others are away. Where are your people now?" "In the marketplace." The man muttered to himself, "homeless and in the marketplace. And what will they do?" The boy shook his head. "I think that my father will find us some shelter," he said finally. He was thinking. He hesitated, for he had been taught never to speak of troubles before strangers, though the girl peered straight into his eyes with great kindness and sweetness. "There is something curious here," thought the man. "The boy's face has a high degree of intelligence, and his speech is the speech of one who has listened to good words. A noble action, this. I think in good faith that the whelp might have had his teeth in the child's throat." Looking down upon the boy, he said, "You have rendered us a noteworthy service. You have saved my niece from much painful injury. Will you not accompany us to our home that we may hear your whole story, and perhaps in our turn?" The boy's face reddened. "Nay," he said, "I wish no reward. What I did—" The girl caught him up. "Indeed, you do my uncle wrong," he meant. "But this, we live humbly. Will you not come and rest for a moment until you may join your people?" "I ask pardon," the boy said quickly. Whereat the man laughed, for their speech and expression had been over-serious for children, though it still was an age when children grew to be men and women often over a single night. In some provinces, girls of 14 or 15 were considered grown women and even given in marriage. Boys at that age had seen much of the rough side of life, of war and battle and cruelty. "I will go with you," Joseph added, kissing the cuff of the gown of the man in black as he had always been taught to do in his home. They turned to the left past the church of the Franciscans, to the right through a short lane, and then to the left again into the most curious street of the world of that day. It was the Street of the Pigeons, famed throughout all Europe as the dwelling place of scholars, astrologers, magicians, students, and likewise doctors, brothers of the church, and masters of the 7 arts. In the worst end of the street, The upper end, near the city wall, clustered the squalid dwelling places that were once the homes of Jewish refugees fleeing from persecution in all parts of the world. Terrible poverty had existed there, and when the Jewish inhabitants finally moved to their own city, Kazimierz, across the river, the buildings which they left were scarcely fit for human beings to live in. They were in the part of wood, though the fronts on the street were sometimes of brick, covered with rough cement or mortar. The upper stories usually overhung, and the roofs were covered with loose boards nailed in place, serving instead of tiles or shingles. Rickety staircases on the outsides of these buildings led from the street or from interior courts up to the dwelling places on the third and fourth floors where, at the time of this story, lived family literally heaped upon family in terrible disorder and poverty. Thieves and murderers crouched there in hiding during the day. Bands of lawless men had their haunts there in cellar or attic or other den. A fire in the year 1407 had swept through this street and through St. Anne's, clearing out many of these undesirable places, but unfortunately not destroying all of them. In the lower end of the street, on the side toward the University of Krakow, there was more respectability since students and masters of the university inhabited there. A large students' bursa or dormitory stood near the corner where Jagiellonska now meets the Street of the Pigeons. In this lived many students. Others put up nearby in groups or with private families, since it was not until late in the 1490s that the authorities compelled the students to live in university buildings. The prestige of the various colleges and the reputation of the men who taught there had drawn to Krakow not only genuine students, but also many of the craft that live by their wits in all societies, in all ages, fortune-tellers and astrologers, magicians and palmists, charlatans, necromancers, and fly-by-nights who were forever eluding the authorities of the law. Here somewhere on the Street of the Pigeons they all found lodging. In the rooms above the street, in the kitchens beneath the street, these men plied their trades. Self-termed astrologers read in the stars the destinies of the gullible. They foretold happiness to trusting peasant girls who came to them for advice in their love matters. They prophesied disaster to merchants who, held by fear, might be induced to part with much money. They cheated, they robbed, and often on provocation they killed, until after many years they gave the street a certain unsavory reputation. Against the machinations of these men, the influence of the university was ever working, and the first great blow that many of these magic crafts and black arts received was struck by Nicholas Copernic, better known as Copernicus. Many years later, when Joseph Charnetski was a very old man, Copernicus, working with rough implements, even before the telescope had been invented, proved to men for the first time that the heavenly bodies, stars, and planets move in the skies according to well-fixed and definitely determined laws, subject only to the will of the Creator of the universe, and that they have all about them in the street flitted men dressed in long robes like that of the guardian of the little girl, though all the robes were not alike. Some were clerical with closed front and collar, others were open and flowing with great sleeves like a bishop's gown. Some were of blue, some were of red, some were of green. Joseph noticed one robe of ermine over which was worn a chain of heavy gold, at the end of which hung suspended a great amethyst cross. They passed a house, part wood and part stone, where were gathered at open doors a great group of young men in plain black robes, much less sumptuous than some others which they had seen. All the members of the group engaged in a lively altercation, as the guardian informed the boy and girl concerning the movement of the stars. One was contending that the firmament of stars moved for 100 years to the west. Another, and this was backed by a written argument from the old Alphonsian tables from Spain, that the stars moved constantly in one direction without change. Passing this group, they came to a dwelling, the front of which was stone. The door was set back from the street and flanked by short projecting buttresses on either side, put there as if to caution the emerging inhabitant to look carefully to right and left before proceeding, a caution not unwise at night. The windows above were not only crossed by wooden shutters that opened and closed like doors, but also barred with iron. The man in black took from the folds of his gown a huge brass key which he fitted into the outside door, turned it in the lock with some labor, and then threw the portal open. They stepped over a small board which served as a threshold, and passed through a dark passageway which led to an open court. At the end of the court was the flat wall of a monastery without windows or doors. On the right was a low, one-story building, and on the left rose a ramshackle structure of wood, 4 stories high. Outside this building, leading to the apartments on the 2nd and 3rd floors, was a wooden staircase hitched to the wall by wooden clutch supports and strengthened by a single wooden upright. In the middle of the court was an old well with a bucket on a rope attached to a wheel. The staircase creaked as they ascended, and seemed to Joseph to swing just a little. It gave him such a dizzy sensation that he clutched at the wall, fearful lest the whole structure should become loose and topple down. But the man only smiled as he saw the boy's sudden movement, and assured him that the staircase was safe enough. They went up 1 flight past the first landing, and then on to the 2nd. Here they stopped, and the man reached into his gown for another key, a smaller one this time. Just as they were entering the apartment on the 3rd floor opposite this landing, Joseph noticed that there was still 1 more floor above them, even though the main staircase ended with the 3rd floor. The entrance to this top floor, which appeared to have been at one time a loft or storeroom, was gained by climbing a crude, ladder-like staircase with a single rail which was fastened at a slight angle against the wall. The door to which these steps led was directly above the farther end of the landing, and to Joseph's surprise appeared to be of metal. From its shape and size, the boy decided that it was a window that had been changed into an entrance, while at its right a square aperture had been cut in the wall, probably for the purpose of giving light. In an instant they were in the apartment where the man and girl lived, and Joseph had no further chance to study the loft which in some unexplainable manner had aroused his curiosity. This apartment was stuffy and poorly lighted, but the furnishings were not poor. There were tapestries and great oaken chairs, a heavy table in the middle of the room, several huge chests, and a sideboard upon which some silver glistened. The girl ran quickly to a shutter and threw it open, whereupon the light streamed in through a myriad of small glass panes set in lead. Quickly she set before Joseph and the man in black small goblets which she filled with wine. A few pieces of broken bread were placed before them on the table, and they all ate, Joseph rather voraciously, although striving to disguise his hunger. "Now tell us your story," the man bade him. Joseph related it briefly, emphasizing for the most part the arrival of his father and mother and himself in the city that morning, and the dilemma that faced them in procuring lodgings. The man in the black robe listened attentively, and when the boy had finished, he struck the table a light blow. "I think I have it," he said. "Wait here for me, and take what refreshment you will. I will be back in a few moments." He went out through the door and hurried down the stairs to one of the apartments below. The girl pushed her chair closer to Joseph's and looked up into his eyes. "What is your name?" she asked. "I am Joseph Charnetski." "Joseph," she said. "I like the name much. Mine is Elzbietka." "My father is Andrew Charnetski," continued Joseph, "and we lived in the country of the Black Lands in the Ukraine. It was lonely in our neighborhood, for the nearest neighbor was 60 staja away, yet we never felt fear of Cossack or Tartar, though others did, for my father always treated them well. We were therefore surprised not long ago when there came to us a former servant, a friendly Tartar, who said that we were in some danger, and although my father laughed, I know that he gave the report some credence, since he took the Tartar aside and talked with him privately for a long time. He is not one to reveal his fear, however, and we remained in our house as before, with the warning all but forgotten by my mother and me. Then one night before we went to bed, my mother, who was working upon some sewing, saw a man's face peeping in through the thatch at one corner of our house. It was a face that she had never seen before. It was not one of the servants of our place, or any place next to ours. It was a villainous face, and it made such an impression on her that she screamed aloud, alarming us all. "Yes!" The blue eyes were full of interest. That night my father came into the room where I was sleeping, bade me dress quickly, and in a short time led me and my mother through a little door in the rear of the house that I had never seen opened before, since it had always been fastened with nails. Outside this door we found ourselves in a passageway dug out of the earth like a cave, and through this we crept until we emerged into a shed some distance from the other dwellings, where 2 of our best horses were hitched to a cart. That my father had already taken such precautions unknown to us assured me that he had feared something, the nature of which he had kept from us. But you know now. Nay, the most curious part is yet to come. My mother and I climbed into the wagon where a goodly supply of food had been stored, while my father, moving swiftly, wielded a forked stick with such effect in one corner of the shed that he soon unearthed a pile of vegetables which had been covered over with tree branches and leaves in order to preserve them. I thought at the time that he was about to put some of them into our wagon for food, but to my surprise he chose only one. And that... a pumpkin! A pumpkin! But why? I know no more about it than you. When everything else in our wagon had been eaten, Father refused to give it up. This was 10 days later, of course, when we were on the last stages of our journey, and once, indeed, this very morning, a man who had evidently pursued us from the Ukraine offered my father the pumpkin's weight in gold in exchange for it. But my father refused. Did you learn whose face your mother saw in the thatch? That I did not. But what came later proved that my father had acted wisely in leaving our house secretly and in a hurry. For when we stopped in a village a few days later to rest our horses, we saw a neighbor who had traveled from our part of the country on horseback. He had passed our place on the day after we left. Every building had been burned to the ground, he told us, and the land itself looked as if a battle had raged there. The wheat was down and the crops were burnt, and holes had been dug everywhere, as if the invaders had hunted for hidden treasure. Your father has the pumpkin now. It is safe in his possession, though why he refused its weight in gold I cannot see. But I think he would not be pleased that I have told all this about it, although I know that the secret is safe with you. Now tell me something of yourself. This man whom you called uncle, is he your father's brother? That he is. My mother and father died in the plague that spread through the town when I was small. He is a master of arts in the university, and a very great scholar, she added proudly. His name is Nicholas Kreutz, and among those most famed in the university in alchemy he is indeed the greatest. He is not a servant of the church, though a good Christian, and he seeks, as do many others, the secrets of his craft. The scholar-alchemist appeared suddenly in the doorway and smiled at them. I have just ascertained, he said, seating himself at the table, that if it pleases your father, there is a haven for you all here in this very house. There is not much to pay, and a shelter, however lowly, is better than the sky when night falls. Your father might sell his pair of horses. Horses bring a good price at present, I hear, and he could live here until some suitable employment appears. Unless, he added, the place is too humble. Indeed, that cannot be, said the boy eagerly. Gladly at this minute will he welcome any roof for the sake of my mother, who is somewhat tired after the long journey from the Ukraine. I cannot go too swiftly to tell him of this news, but only assure me that you are in sober earnest about this matter. Elzbietka sprang up from her chair. Did you but know him as well as I, you would not doubt. At that the alchemist enveloped her with his long arms from which hung the black sleeves of his gown, until she smiled out from the embrace at Joseph like one caught between the wings of a great raven or crow. "Hurry and tell your people," she commanded him, "and bring them back here. Indeed, I never knew what a mother was, if I but please her." "That you will," shouted Joseph. "I will go as soon as Pan Kreutz unlocks the door for me below. Tell your people that it is the floor beneath us that is unoccupied," directed the alchemist as he let the boy out through the gate. "There are only 2 rooms there, a large and a small one, but they will serve your purposes for the time, I believe." Joseph thanked him with all his heart and set out on the run for the marketplace. The street of the pigeons seemed to unwind before him as he ran, and he was soon in the street leading directly to the cloth hall. Turning there past one corner of the town hall, he ran directly by the cloth markets and headed for the little church near which his father had unloosed the horses. But no sooner had his eyes fallen upon the wagon and his father and mother standing in it than he stopped suddenly in astonishment. Then, like an arrow leaving a bow, he darted forward, for what he saw set his heart beating faster than it had beaten in all that eventful day. The stranger that they had left in the mud by the roadside that morning stood by the side of the wagon with a crowd of ruffians at his heels, threatening and shouting at Pan Andrew and his wife. The stranger carried a huge club, and the ruffians, of whom he appeared to be the leader, were armed with staves and stones and were shouting angrily as if intent on harming the man and woman above them. Pan Andrew, in facing them, had stepped in front of his wife to shield her if stones were thrown, and the sight of the resistance and the cries of the leader and his attackers soon brought a huge crowd surging about the wagon, for it was now close on to noon, and the morning's business of the market was well nigh finished, and many citizens and farmers were eating or resting in the shade of the trees about the square. Joseph darted through the crowd and leaped up on the wagon to stand by his father's side. "Ha! We have the cub as well," shouted the one who had boasted of the name Ostrovsky in the early morning. "He is a wizard like unto the father, and a witch like the mother, for it was he who made my horse fly straight up to heaven this morning with a blow upon the flank." At that, a great skulk in the crowd let fly a stone at the 3 which missed Pan Andrew but narrowly. "Magicians, wizards, witches," hooted the crowd. "It is the man who is the worst," shouted the self-named Ostrovsky. "It is he who hath bewitched my brother and cut off his head and changed the head into a pumpkin. If he be honest, let him deliver that pumpkin over to me in the sight of all, that I may give Christian burial to my brother's brains." "He is a wizard, yea, and one condemned by church and court and precept. At him! Kill him! But save me the pumpkin which is the head of my brother." Absurd as these accusations seem today, they did not seem so in the 15th century. For men were then but beginning to see the folly of many superstitions and cruelties that had been prevalent since the Dark Ages. They believed that certain persons had malign powers such as could transform others into strange animals. They thought that by magic men could work out their spite upon others in horribly malicious ways, that food could be poisoned by charms and milk made sour. And to raise the cry of wizard against a man, no matter how peace-loving and innocent he might be, was enough to start rough and brutal men, yes, and women too, into active persecution and unlawful deeds. This was the method that the stranger had adopted in order to get his revenge upon Pan Andrew, And not only revenge, but that which he sought even more keenly, the possession of the pumpkin that the country gentleman had refused to deliver to him early in the day. He had been about the city seeking out certain friends or followers in order to raise the cry of wizard, and then he had with them searched through the city until they came upon Pan Andrew and his wife. The pumpkin, it is my brother's head, he kept shouting. Pan Andrew, on his side, only smiled back derisively upon him, and gathered in the pumpkin where no man could seize it without taking as well a blow from his heavy sword, and the attackers, being more cowards than men, made no attempt to approach the wagon at the side that he was facing. Some armed with large stones were, however, sneaking around to get behind him, and others in front were preparing to send a volley of missiles upon him, when there rushed into the turmoil a man of venerable appearance, clad in a brown robe with large puffy sleeves and pointed hood. He was of moderate stature, firm of gait, and bore himself like a man in the prime of life. A priest he might have been, a brother of some order he seemed, but a scholar he was, certainly, for there was that in his face and a droop to the shoulders that proclaimed him a man of letters. "Cease, cease, cowards all," he shouted in a commanding tone of voice. "What persecution goes on here? The man and the woman and boy are workers in magic, wizards and a witch," said the leader roughly. "Keep your hands off, for we are admonishing them." "Wizards and witches, fiddlesticks!" shouted the newcomer, pulling himself up in the wagon until he stood beside Pan Andrew. "This is but an excuse for some such deed of violence as this city has seen too much of in the past 12 months. To attack an honest man, for to any but a blind man he appears as honest, a weak woman, and a defenseless boy. Cowards all, I say, disperse, or I will call the king's guards to disperse you." "It is Jan Canty himself," said one of the rioters in a loud whisper that all about him heard. "I'm off for one." And throwing his stick to the ground, he took to his heels. If there had been no magic in Pan Andrew, his wife, or his boy, there was magic in the name of Jean Canty, and a very healthy magic too, for at once every hat in that crowd came off, and men began to look askance at each other as if caught in some shameful thing. "The good Jan Canty," was whispered on every side, and in the briefest person, not even the leader of the ruffians who had begun the attack. Chapter 4. The good Jan Canty. Among the most remarkable personages of Krakow's age of glory in the 15th century was a certain scholar-priest by the name of Jan Canty. He had been educated at the University of Krakow in the period of late scholasticism, when the chief teachings were still mere expositions of the 7 arts of which grammar was the king. However, a full life and much contact with men had made Jan Canty a well-rounded man. He loved learning for its own sake, but he honored most of all its precepts and its application to life, and he gave himself over in his cell-like quarters on the lower floor of the old university building, now long since destroyed by fire, to the creation of new points of view on old subjects, to comments on the conduct and opinions of the masters and doctors of the university at the great church councils of Europe, and to an intellectual chronicle of his age. His life was saintly, and his cell was as much visited, perhaps, as is his shrine in the magnificent old university library today. The peasants loved him especially, and this was rather curious, since the men from the farms rarely sought the advice of the men of the university. They were, in fact, somewhat shy of the dispensers of higher learning. They were not shy of Jan Canty, however. They came to Krakow to ask his opinion on the weather in the seasons of grains and vegetables. They called upon him for decisions in disputes between landowners. They consulted him concerning the proper kind of food for their livestock. They questioned him on all problems having to do with morals or religion, and they accepted his rulings with as much finality and satisfaction as if they had been the rulings of heaven. Therefore his name was one to be reckoned with everywhere, inside the city and out. He hated above all things cruelty of man against man, or of man against something helpless, a horse or a dog or a child. And when he saw one man and a woman and a boy of honest features and good appearance harassed by some 100 men, he did not hesitate, but rushed into the midst of the flying stones without regard to his own safety or comfort. "Peace be with you," he said to Pan Andrew when the crowd had scattered, "and with you, my daughter," putting his hand upon the woman's head. "What may be the cause of such mischance?" "You are strangers here?" "Strangers and worse, homeless," said Pan Andrew. "You are come from a long distance?" "The Ukraine." The kind shoulders rocked in agitation. My, but surely you have friends in town?" "I have none. I had a friend here and sought him, but he is dead. My house is burned by Tartars, my wealth is gone. I am pursued by men who seek my life and the one possession that I have left." Here he touched the pumpkin with his foot. "But why this accusation of magic?" Pan Andrew smiled. "A trick it was to raise feelings against me in the public square, and then to despoil me of this possession. I think that he who raised the storm against me here has followed me many miles across the border, and I believe that he is the agent of some more powerful person." "There is much to this, my good. You are a priest?" "Men call me so. I am but a servant of the Father of us all." "Then, good father, hear me. I seek to do no man wrong. I am helpless in a world of plotting and troubles, and I seek only a place where I may this night provide shelter for my good wife and my boy." "Come with me, then," said the scholar priest. "I will at least offer you the hospitality that my cell affords." "Nay, hitch your horses to the wagon and drive through that lane yonder which leads to the street of St. Anne." Pan Andrew was already adjusting the harnesses when Joseph tugged at his sleeve. "Father," he urged, "Father, I know of a place where we can stay." The father looked down at him in astonishment. "You," he answered, "you? And how did you find such a place?" "A scholar and his niece live there. They took me to their house. There is a space below them at the head of a flight of stairs," Jan Canty interposed. "Come at any rate to my dwelling, and there we can make plans. If the boy has found a place, and his face and words seem truthful, then we can talk at better length there at our ease than here in the busy square." A few minutes later they stopped in front of the largest of a number of buildings which made up the university. On the way there, Joseph had noted that almost every man they passed on the street had doffed his hat to Jan Canty, and once a whole company of knights had saluted him with drawn swords. He seemed to pay but little attention to these courtesies, however, for his mind was busy with the problem of the present, and when he alighted from the cart and led the three to his little cell on the ground floor just at the right of the door, he was still pondering. Once inside the house, however, Pan Andrew, disregarding Joseph's information for the minute, begged an immediate audience with Jan Canty alone, and while the boy and his mother were eating some food which the scholar had placed upon a table in the corridor just outside his cell, he began to address his host in a low tone. Their voices buzzed as Joseph and his mother ate. Only once did the boy catch distinct syllables, and that was when the priest asked Pan Andrew, "That, then, is the pumpkin that you have brought from the Ukraine?" Pan Andrew must have nodded, for he made no verbal answer. He had not dropped the precious vegetable from his hands during the entire conversation. Joseph heard no more of the talk, for he began at that moment to tell his mother of his own adventures of the morning. As he progressed with his story, she ceased eating and stared at him.
"Why, this is a very miracle," she said.
"As soon as Pan Andrew has finished with the good father in the next room, we will go straight about procuring the lodging of which the scholar told you." "And the poor child, she lost her father and mother in the plague? Indeed, I think that God must have sent us to her. Yankanti at the farther end of the cell listened to Pan Andrew's tale to the very end. He asked a few questions which the other answered, and then the two began to converse rapidly, though in low tones. At length, Yankanti passed his hand across his eyes as if thinking very deeply. Then he said, "It seems to me that there is one course open to you. You have enemies in the city, you believe, and therefore you must remain for the present unseen. I advise a change of name, for such subterfuge is no sin where the end to be gained is righteous. For your present needs you can obtain money by selling your horses and cart. If you wish, I will send a man with them to the horse market in the plain below the Wawel. They would be but an encumbrance to you at best, and moreover they will bring a pretty price, since they are of good stock and well fed."
"This money will not last me forever," said Pan Andrew.
"I must think of some employment besides. I have thought of that," continued Yankanti. "I know of employment which might suit your case, even though it be a humble task." "It cannot be too humble for me," answered the other quickly, "provided it brings enough return for the support of my wife and boy." "Good, excellent," exclaimed the scholar. "Then I have just the thing. You were a hunter in the old days, I presume?" "Why, yes," said Pan Andrew, wondering. "And you can sound the horn?" "That I can. And if I do say it with more skill than any hunter in the eastern marches." "Good. G.P. But yet one thing. This news which you have imparted to me should be for the ears of the king alone. The treasure which you guard should be returned to him. It should become the property of the Commonwealth. I know not what harm it has already done in the world. I only hope that it may do no more. Would you leave it with me for safekeeping, perhaps? Would that I could! But it was the oath that I took to my father that it should never leave my hands while life remained, save to one person, and that person the King of Poland. Then God be with you. Rest here until the horses are sold, and then, after hearing your son's story, we will think of tomorrow." He called the mother and boy into his cell. "Why, here," he said on hearing the story of Joseph's adventure from his mother's lips, "is the thing arranged to perfection. I know the place you mention, and I know the scholar Kreutz as well. A curious man, and of certain strange disposition, but honest and sincere, and a seeker after light. He is, I think, feared by the common people, as are also many dwellers in the next street, which has been since olden times inhabited by sorcerers and their ilk, and the court of his house is but little frequented. They tell strange tales of him sometimes, most of which I know to be false. But it is just the place for your dwelling at present, since there is little likelihood of your being disturbed there." At this, so great a feeling of thankfulness came upon Joseph's mother that she would have fallen to her knees and asked the good father for his blessing, but he restrained her. "Nay, daughter," he said, "it is I who need thy blessing, since I know what fortitude and courage thy kind heart possesses." She kissed his hand nevertheless, as did Joseph immediately afterward, and Pan Andrew turned away quickly lest they should see that his eyes were moist, for there is such power in kindness well bestowed that it touches the wells of human feeling. There was, too, something in this scholar-priest that went at once to the heart, some fine quality of feeling and spirituality that set him apart, though ever so sweetly and gently, from other men. A servant of the university was dispatched to sell the horses and cart, and Joseph with his father and mother sat down to await the man's return. While they were waiting, there came a knocking upon the outside door. Yankanti went to it at once. A woman stood there with a baby in her arms, not in the attitude of one asking for alms, but of one seeking advice. She came, it seemed, from the Black Village, and was suffering much from pains that took her legs and arms and neck. Yankanti questioned her quietly. "Where do you sleep?" he asked. "On the floor, reverend sir," she answered, "and the aches and pains are so strong that I can stand them no longer. It is certain that a devil possesses me, and I would that you should pray him away. Is the floor made of stones? It is. Are the stones ever wet? No, reverend sir, except in spring. Is the earth damp beneath the stones? Why, yes, perhaps, she said. Sometimes when the well water is not much used, it overflows, for there is a source there, and sometimes when they have been drawing water carelessly, the overflow leaks down beneath the stones. Then take heed to what I say, and the aches and pains will pass. Take stones and build a low wall between the well and the side of your cottage. Make this waterproof, and then dig a drain that will carry the water away from your house. Hang your bedclothes often in the sun, and be sure that they are always dry. Change every week the boughs upon which you lie, thus will the pains go away. She kissed his hand and departed. Then came a peasant who complained that worms were coming up from the ground and were destroying the young shoots of his plants. "Could you but say a prayer, father," the man supplicated, "the worms will cease." "It is for you to prevent them," said Yankanti. "Sprinkle all the earth about the plants with ashes which you take from your stove. If this does not prevent the worms, then rise early in the morning and pour water about the plants. The worms will then come to the top where the water is, and you may kill them." Then, stooping over a high desk, he began to write upon a long scroll of parchment, the end of which hung far over the desk, almost to the floor. He used for writing the quill of a pigeon thrust into a piece of oak wood. Joseph curled up on a bench that ran along beneath the windows and closed his eyes. What a day it had been! And what might the future hold? His thoughts, which at first had begun to run slowly, suddenly became brisk and grew fantastic. He seemed to see himself bearing armor, a shield, and a sword, fighting desperately with a great dark-browed Tartar who had, instead of a head, a huge yellow pumpkin. Then the Tartar suddenly took off his head, and carrying it in his arms, climbed up a steep ladder to a room that seemed to hang from the stars. Out of it came lightning and flashes of strangely colored light, and suddenly the Tartar emerged, now with the head of a dog, and the pumpkin floating along beside him as if it were but a ball of feathers in the wind. The scratching of Jean Canty's quill grew fainter and fainter, and the fantastic world dimmed slowly in blackness. Joseph was fast asleep. When he awoke, the room was no longer filled with sunshine. A single candle lantern was burning at the farther end of the cell, and by its light he could see his father, Jan Canty, and his mother busied with something that lay in front of them upon the table. He rubbed his eyes to make sure that he was awake. Yes, it was the mysterious pumpkin from which his father was slicing away the outer rind with a huge knife. It was a curious pumpkin, that vegetable. The rind was so hard and brittle that the knife scraped on it as if it were cutting or whittling away a piece of board. Joseph, fascinated, watched the process, almost afraid to breathe. Little by little, the hard pieces dropped to the floor like bits of shell as the blade cut them through. "I think," the father was saying in a low voice, "that I hold here in my hand the reason for the attack on my house in the Ukraine, and that the man who has hounded us today knew very well what this pumpkin shell contained. He had been told that I had it in my possession. He knew the exact size of my property, and he quickly put two and two together when he saw this pumpkin, and only this pumpkin, in my wagon. The reason that I made no effort to conceal it was, of course, to allay any suspicion concerning it." "But," interrupted Jan Canty, "a pumpkin at this time of year is likely to create some curiosity among those who give the matter a second thought. This is a late pumpkin, and I suppose that in all Poland it would be hard to find another such in midsummer." "True," replied Pan Andrew, "but I had to risk that. Long ago, when I was worried over this sacred charge and feared lest some enemy might discover its existence and attempt to rob me, there came to me the idea of a shell like this as an excellent means of concealment. Since that day there has never been a time, summer or winter, when there was not a pumpkin shell in readiness for an emergency, and many an experiment was I obliged to make, indeed, before I was able to preserve a shell in the good condition of this one. At this moment he cut away the last piece of the rind. The room was suddenly filled with the light of 1,000 candles. Colors of the rainbow fell upon the walls. A huge center of radiance like the sun in the heavens blazed into being at the very place where the pumpkin shell had been but a moment before. Flickering, dancing flecks of light leaped about the room and transformed its gloom into the brilliancy of day. And then there was again but the light of the little lantern, for the father had placed that which the pumpkin contained in a bag furnished by Jan Canty, and was busy tying up the open side when Joseph came rushing up to the table. "Father," he cried, "what was it? What was the light which came from that which you took from the pumpkin?" The father's voice was kindly but firm. "In time, Joseph, you shall know. It would be but a care to you, a matter of more worry than you suspect, if you knew what responsibility we are carrying here. If it is mere curiosity, be assured that knowledge will bring nothing but pain. If it is real interest, I will tell you plainly that in due time you shall be informed of all that has passed. Just now, it has cost me so much that I have not the heart to burden your young life with its secrets." He broke off and, after a short silence, changed the subject. "We will go now to that place which you have found for us. While you slept, the Reverend Father and I have been to see your friends. He has seen to it that the rooms have been made comfortable, and there we shall stay, at least for the present." Chapter 5. In the Street of the Pigeons. St. Anne's Street was as black as pitch when they emerged from the habitation of the scholar-priest. He insisted on accompanying them, and carried his little candle-lantern for aid, which, though it threw a faint light upon the ground a step or two ahead, yet had not much more light than the stars which shone down from a moonless sky. Pan Andrew, with his wife on his right arm, followed Jan Canty, and Joseph brought up the rear. They had taken but a few steps along the narrow footwalk by the side of the road, when something damp and clammy was forced into the boy's right hand. He gave a little startled jump, but reassured himself at the next minute that it was nothing but the nose of a stray dog that had sought his hand as a token of friendly greeting. "And as I live," thought Joseph, as he reached down and felt a great shaggy head, "it's like the wolf-dog that leaped at Elzbietka this very day. Yes, it's about the same size, and here the collar is exactly the same that I had my fingers through. I know its feel by those little knobs that almost tear the flesh. Father! Father!" he called. Pan Andrew turned about quickly. "What is it?" "A dog," answered the boy, "a friendly dog." "Bring him along with us," said the father with a laugh. "We can't have too many friends just now." And at that they continued on their way. Now, of all the creatures that God has put in the world, a dog is the most curious, and sometimes, one might think, the most discerning. For when this same animal had broken loose in the morning, his first impulse, which he had followed, had been that of flight. His second impulse was to look for a friend, since no dog can live without a friend. The Tartar boy had already departed. The dog had seen too much of him as it was. Also, by virtue of a rare instinct which dogs, and sometimes horses, possess, the wolf-dog had realized fully that the boy who had leaped at his collar was not an enemy. Perhaps it was the boy's touch, perhaps it was some quality in the tone of his voice, but the animal knew that Joseph was used to dogs, and knew as well that he was just in his treatment of them. Therefore he had searched all day throughout the city streets, and when he came upon this little group of people in the dark street, his sense of smell told him that here was a dog-lover, and marvel of marvels, it was the same dog-lover that had sprung upon him earlier in the day. They turned at length from St. Anne's Street into a side lane that is known today as Jagiellonska, and followed it for a short distance until they reached the Street of the Pigeons. Here they turned to the left and walked for a few steps until suddenly just before them rose a babel of subdued voices. Father Jean Canty stood stock still. The others also came to a halt and remained motionless except for the dog, which strained at Joseph's hold upon his collar. "Stay," said the scholar. "I will go forward to see what may be in the air." And holding his lantern at the height of his head, he plunged into a crowd of black-robed figures that had formed a circle in the very middle of the street. "Students," he cried aloud as he swung his lantern first to this face and then to that. "Students, and what devilment make you here now?" The crowd broke before him at a touch. Either he was much feared by them or greatly respected, that Pan Andrew could see, perhaps both. "A duel!" he exclaimed as he reached the center of the crowd, where a space lighted by a lantern upon the ground had previously been obscured by the bodies of the lookers-on. "And what means it?" Two young men, both students, with their black university robes lying beside them on the ground, stood facing each other with unfastened underjackets. Slender Italian dueling swords or foils held firmly in the clasped fingers of their bared right arms had clashed the instant before Jan Canty entered the arena. "A duel," he repeated. "Do you not know that dueling has been forbidden, I know not how many times within these streets bounding the university? Do you not know that it is punishable by fine or imprisonment even, if the duelers are students?" His hands groped fearlessly for the weapons. "This is no play duel," he cried as he gathered them in. Indeed it was not. The young men were fighting with naked rapiers. In most of the students' duels, the points of the weapons were capped with buttons to make them less dangerous, or if the engagements were to be with broadswords, the opponents wore breastplates and heavy gauntlets and helmets. But here stood two young men without a single precaution against injury, and it was quite evident that one of them would have been badly wounded had not the scholar brought the fight to an end. "What means this?" he repeated. "Who may you be?" Holding the lantern close up to the face of the nearer, he cried out suddenly in astonishment, "Johann Tring! As much would I have thought of seeing you here as I would have of seeing our own Lord Cardinal, you whom I thought more a slave to a crucible than to a sword." "And your name?" he thundered at the other. "Conrad Mlinarchy of Mazovia," answered the student, thrusting his weapon back into his girdle and letting his eyes drop for shame. "A Mazovian. Well, it rejoices me that you are ashamed, and there was perhaps reason for your anger, since I hear that Mazovians are insulted without much thought these days. Go to your room. I will hear your story tomorrow. And you?" He turned to the remnants of the original crowd, those few who remained, maliciously hoping to see punishment meted out to the offenders. "Betake yourselves to your bursars with all possible speed, for if I see one of you here when I return, I will notify the authorities in the morning."